throughout our organization's history, we've campaigned against corporate free trade deals like NAFTA, CUSMA, that put profits before people and the planet. And so I'm really happy to be talking about this subject this morning because this is something that has been and continues to be at the heart of the preoccupations of our organization. And I think the first thing I really wanted to say was that questions of how to disentangle Canada and Quebec's economies from the empire in decline to our south are on the table now for the first time in a generation, right? Like, this is new, and this is quite surprising, I would say, because up until Trump came into office, this was the neoliberal trade architecture was really presented as a settled thing. It had just faded into the background of our political economic lives, and it was just treated as, you know, and this is something that I experienced as a trade campaigner. So I should, full disclosure, I'm not an economist, and maybe I'll say some things that you disagree with, but I'm a campaigner. I've read a lot about economics. But this is something that we experienced as an organization that tries to challenge these deals and question their presuppositions, was that it's often difficult to get traction because it had become just, you know, ça faisait partie du décor, right? And that's changed radically with Trump's threats to Canada's sovereignty and with his completely unprovoked trade war that he's launched. And so this is not just like wishful thinking on the part of the Council of Canadians. This is not just electoral rhetoric that was coming from the Liberal Party, from Mark Carney. This is also the conclusions that you know, leading neoliberal thinkers, bank economists, the people who built this order are saying that themselves. So Tom DeCino, I don't know if anyone knows who Tom DeCino is. He was the head of the Business Council on National Issues for many, many years, which was probably the leading corporate lobby group that helped to push free trade in the 1980s and 90s. He published a report recently where he said, even if we can negotiate an extension of CUSMA and the withdrawal of tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, what is the worth of Donald Trump's signature? Even if he were to withdraw both the tariffs and his threats to annex Canada, the relationship could not go back to how it was, because Canadians can never assume that they will not become the targets of actions to undermine their sovereignty or their economic well-being. And you have, you know, bank economists from CIBC saying the same thing, saying any deal that we sign with the Americans now, it's not going to be worth the paper it's written on. You have lobbyists like Paul Deegan and Kevin Lynch, who are two high-powered former civil servants who are also on the board of BMO, saying, you know, we need to realize that the trade deals we've had with the US since the original FTA in 1988 are essentially dead. You know, Flavio Volpe, head of the auto parts industry lobbyist, saying, you know, we're very likely to make peace with the Americans, but we should never go back to trusting that peace. We should never go back to the thing that I think people across the spectrum in this country criticize Canada for, which is lack of national ambition, right? And even someone like a Harper policy advisor like Sean Speer, writing in the Hub, saying, you know, essentially the same thing, that we need to understand that we're living through a historic moment that should be understood as the end of NAFTA, if not in law, then certainly in practice, right? And so, and for people like Speer, this is a tragedy, right? They say, from now on, trade is going to be dominated by political decisions and policy, and this is a terrible and regrettable thing. And so the first point, which I think is a pretty obvious point, and probably most people would agree with, but it needs to be underlined, is that the old consensus on trade, the old kind of free trade ideology is dead, and we should welcome that fact, because it deserved to die, right? When these deals were first being negotiated, the Council of Canadians raised a number of criticisms about them. We argued that they would decimate manufacturing employment and drive down workers' wages as corporations restructured their production across borders to seek lower wages and lower costs. We argued that the elements of the deals, like investor-state dispute mechanisms, would erode our democracy and our ability to regulate business and protect the environment. We argued that the pressure to attract increasingly footloose foreign investors would erode our tax base, and the pressure to provide subsidies and tax cuts in order to attract footloose foreign investment and multinationals would mean that inevitably our public services would come under extreme pressure, especially our healthcare system. And so these were really the arguments that the council was making from day one, from its founding in 1985. Against that, the free traders, people like Tom DeCino, said, no, it'll be great. Don't worry, trust us. It's going to be a tonic for manufacturing. Productivity is going to go up. There'll be jobs, there'll be growth, and all that private sector wealth that is just going to be gushing up from this new economic order that we're going to usher in is going to be able to fund the welfare state, which of course we don't want to do anything to. So that was the debate as it kind of played out in the late 80s and early 90s. And I mean, even before Trump came in and started to dismantle this order in order to replace it with something that I would argue is going to be probably much, much worse than what we already have, it was already a pretty rotten setup, all right? Rather than growing the tax base and funding expanded public services, as we all know, the benefits of restructured supply chains and increased trade accrued overwhelmingly to corporations and their shareholders. Rather than getting a vigorously competitive economy, Canadians got an economic landscape dominated by oligopolies, right? The result of corporate consolidation on a continental scale. And rather than a rising tide that would lift all boats, Canadians experienced stagnant wages, rising prices, and spiraling income and wealth inequality. And so I think that, was kind of symptomatic of where we were at before Trump came in. And so now we have this crisis of the setup that was established over those years. I think by the 2010s or so, it became increasingly settled and kind of faded into the background. But even its defenders before the crisis with Trump were able to recognize that it wasn't working that well, even on its own terms, right? Andrew Coyne had an article that appeared a few months before the Trump crisis trade war started, and he was saying, Canada's trade and broader economic policies have been an example of everything that orthodox economics would recommend as recipes for prosperity, right? And yet, productivity has slumped in Canada, growth rates have fallen, and he was lamenting, he was like, how can this be, right? We did everything right. And so this is even beforehand. And so I think even on their own terms, the model that had been installed was failing and deserves to be thrown out. So how has the corporate elite reacted since the crisis? So I want to talk a bit about their agenda, and then I want to talk about what I think our agenda should be. They have seized on this crisis, as they have in the past, to advance their interests. And what struck me the most about the response from organizations like the Business Council of Canada, which is one of the successor to the BCNI, the Business Council on National Issues. It's a lobby group that brings together the 150 CEOs of the largest corporations in Canada, but there's others like the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and so on. And so one of the things I do as a trade campaigner for the council is I follow what these people are saying and what policies they're pushing and how they're doing it, who are they lobbying. And I'm just really struck by the staggering lack of political imagination and policy imagination coming from our elites, right? I think I'll start with the easy one, which is internal trade, right? So we have the US president saying, I am going to destroy Canada's auto industry, right? He's openly saying it. He's like, we don't want your cars anymore. We're going to do everything we can to bring back the auto industry. It's already leading to layoffs in the parts sector and in the assembly sector in Southern Ontario. We're going to wipe it out, right? And what's the response? Well, the first response was, well, don't worry. We're going to get rid of barriers to internal trade, right? And this has been taken incredibly seriously. And I don't really understand how, right? What? We're going to lose our auto industry, but it's okay because we're going to be able to order wine from BC on the internet? Like, are we seriously supposed to believe that? And I know it's based on these studies by Trevor Toome from the University of Calgary. It's the econometric studies, and Mark Lee and others have done a lot of work on this, and I think they've shown pretty convincingly that the assumptions are totally bogus. But it really made me think of that old joke about economists in economic history saying economic history is like looking for a black cat in a darkened room. Economics is like looking for a black cat in a darkened room when there is no cat. And econometrics is like looking for a black cat in a darkened room when there is no cat and exclaiming, "We found the cat," you know? And so Toom thinks he's found the cat, and the corporate elite kind of went with that. And for me, that doesn't signify that, I don't think they even believe it. I mean, it played two roles. One was just like, it was a placeholder for the vacuum in political thinking of like, what are we gonna do? And it's just like, oh, okay, internal trade. And the other thing was that it was a cover for framing pipelines and the people opposed to pipelines as being opponents or people who are putting up barriers to a national market in Canada. You know, but the lack of imagination extends, right? If you listen to Goldie Hyder, who is currently the CEO of the Business Council of Canada, you know, he says Canada's best response to these threats is to improve our competitiveness, right? So we're going to slash corporate taxes, we're going to weaken environmental regulations, we're going to scrap the proposed carbon emissions cap, and we're going to expedite major infrastructure projects like pipelines, ports, and railways. And so this is, you know, this is kind of presented now as a new national policy, right? Sounds a whole lot like the old national policy, right? The one brought in under John A. Macdonald, where you basically bulldoze over Indigenous title, you rip the resources out of the ground, and you leave everyone else behind. So this is not new thinking. It's not particularly innovative. It's not going to solve any of the problems that the Canadian economy has been grappling with in terms of low growth, in terms of low wages, in terms of inequality, and so on. But that's the best that they've been able to come up with, and they've dressed it up as a kind of a measure to resist Trump. What I find striking is that if you look at what they were saying before the Canadian corporate elite became nationalist, right? What were they saying before, right? When Trump was first making the threats in December and January.
That's
what they started to say. But when Trump first started threatening to annex Canada and saying we're going to impose tariffs, the response was exactly the same, right? It was the same. It was, we need to improve competitive. We need to cut taxes. We need to get rid of environmental regulations. We need to build infrastructure projects so we can dig the minerals, the critical minerals, up out of the ground. You know, and if it means we need to go around, you know, Indigenous land rights or go over it, so be it. You know, and so it's the exact same agenda, right? It's just, in a first time, it was to appease Trump. In a second time, it was to resist Trump. Elbows up, you know, we're going to stop him with this stuff. But it's always the same. It's the same agenda. And I think the one element that, probably the most serious element of this agenda that is a bit different from previous iterations of the corporate agenda that we've seen is there's now a really renewed emphasis on military spending, right?
Yeah.
Military spending is slated to be a huge driver, and if you read what the BCC is saying about this, they say it's going to be dual use, right? So we're going to build guns, tanks, planes, and we're also going to subsidize business and develop high-tech sectors through the defense budget. And so they're calling for an increase of you know, the defense budget, not beyond the 2% NATO target that always gets talked about. They want 2.5%, which would mean hiking current defense expenditures from 41 billion to 110 billion, right, in a relatively short period of time. So that is a huge increase, and they're very conscious of what that would entail for the budget, for the fiscal priorities of the federal government. And so they openly say, you know, we're going to have to cut about 90 billion in non-defense spending over 3 years. This is what they're calling for, and they explicitly refer back to Jean Chrétien's government in the mid-90s and the program spending review that they undertook at that time. And so many of you probably know this, but if you ever look at a graph of inequality in Canada, and when does it take off? You know, there's like a rupture, right? It's 95. It's 95. And so that is a huge event, and I don't think we talk enough about how devastating that was for our public services, for equality, for access to things like unemployment insurance, and all of those things are coming up and biting us in the butt right now with this crisis, because as workers are laid off, they're facing a social safety net that has been absolutely shredded by the kinds of cuts that were affected in the 1990s, and we're facing public services and public sector workers who have been basically run ragged by years and years of austerity, and our public healthcare system is on the brink of collapse. I think that is not an exaggeration to say. My wife is a nurse, and I definitely see it every day when she comes home. She is absolutely exhausted, and that is not at all unique. So the idea that we are going to go into this crisis and we're going to deal with it by more than doubling defense spending and imposing similar cuts on federal support for public services and for individuals is really chilling, right? Because we're not in the same situation that we were in 1995, right? We're in a situation that's much worse. The healthcare system is in much worse shape, and our public services are in much worse shape. And so imposing similar scale of cuts, I think, would be absolutely devastating. And we've seen this agenda being rolled out already by Mark Carney, on the campaign trail was kind of like a Rorschach test, right? He was everything to everyone. Anything you believed in, you could see it in him. He talked about doing a green industrial policy, and he talked about raising military spending. He talked about defending social services, and he's talked about, cutting operational spending, right? Spend less, invest more, and all that stuff. And I mean, I think we're going to see where the priorities lie, but it seems pretty clear that he is taking the Liberal Party in a very kind of strong rightward direction. And we're seeing elements of this corporate agenda being implemented already at the federal level. And it's happening at the provincial level too, right? Here in Quebec, obviously, LNG pipelines are back. François Legault wants us to embrace, fossil fuels once again and get over our opposition to cooking the planet. But that's not unique, It's also happening in Nova Scotia, where the provincial government is trying to lift uranium mining ban and trying to bring back fracking, which is something that environmental movements and Indigenous people fought there for the last few years quite a bit. They had a moratorium in place, so they're trying to lift that. In Ontario, Doug Ford's government is it's maybe the perfect encapsulation of the kind of two-faced nature of the elbows up moment and the two-faced nature of the nationalism of our elites, right? Doug Ford made hay out of this. He had hats that said Canada is not for sale in the recent provincial election, and he won a big majority by saying he was going to stand up to Trump. And then you read what he's proposing now, and he's saying he wants a Fortress Can-Am, right? Fortress Can-Am meaning we are going to set aside the critical minerals that exist, especially in the north of Ontario, in the Ring of Fire, on Indigenous land, as almost always, and we're going to cut out the Chinese, right? So we're going to cut a deal with the Americans, and we're going to say, you get exclusive access to our critical minerals, and we promise you we won't sell them to the Chinese, and we can make this whole trade dispute go away. And so that's his offer to Donald Trump, and this is the big nationalist guy. And the way that they are pushing that agenda forward, they just introduced something, Bill 5, which basically gives ministers the power to, just ignore like land use and zoning and environmental regulations. It's a really broad, sweeping piece of legislation, and environmental organizations and Indigenous, First Nations are absolutely up in arms with this. It's a very grave attack on the environment and on First Nations land rights. But so this is happening across the country, right? We can see this corporate agenda that is doubling down on fossil fuels, is doubling down on extractivism, is doubling down on militarism, and is preparing the ground for a really devastating austerity drive. We can see it happening already at both federal and provincial level. So that's their agenda. I think it's not a very good agenda. We need to define our own approach. I think the first thing I would say with regards to, like, Carney has already started negotiations with Trump, which in of itself is kind of shocking. But I would say the first point is that no deal is better than a bad deal, right? And a bad deal is pretty much all that's on offer with Trump. If you read what the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent from the US, has to say about it, you know, this is basically a global protection racket, right? And I think the similarity with the mafia is not a coincidence. I mean, if you know Trump's history and his connections to mafia-linked lawyers, it's really not an exaggeration. And you know, Bessent even has told audiences, like, we are going to ask countries to buy more US-made defense products. And even, you know, maybe they just, you know, since they're benefiting from our defensive shield, they can just cut us a check, right? He, like, literally said that. The trade representative, Germaine Greer, has said, you know, we are going to make so few concessions, and he told this to Congress. He said, we're going to make so few concessions that you don't have to worry about changing any laws in the US, right? So our trading partners are going to get virtually nothing at the table from us. There's going to be no give and take, and it's just going to be take, take, take. And so I think that just out of the gates should be the common sense position, and unfortunately it doesn't seem to be right now for Mark Carney and his government. But for anyone who is concerned about taking a different path, I think that should be the absolute baseline, which is, you know, no deal is better than a bad deal. Oh yeah, I did want to say something about the auto industry. This is maybe the one exception to the lack of imagination around coming from the corporate elite, and I think it speaks also to maybe the differences in between different fractions of our corporate class. Flavio Volpe recently put forward a proposition for a made-in-Canada EV manufacturing company, and that is probably the only genuinely innovative or new policy idea that I've seen put forward by the Canadian corporate class. And I think that in that case, the existential kind of fear for that industry and those corporations is very real, right? And that sort of explains why Doug Ford, especially, being the Premier of Ontario, has kind of staked out a position that was at times relatively combative towards Trump. But overall, not very impressive. So I think, you know, the scale of the problems that we face, the climate crisis first and foremost, require a rethinking of the entire economic model behind these trade deals. We need trade and investment agreements that will help rather than hinder the shift away from fossil fuels and the massive public investment in infrastructure and manufacturing that it requires. We need deals that will increase rather than erode workers' bargaining power, and that will facilitate the rebuilding of our public services after years of neglect. And we need to use the policy space that the death of NAFTA and CUSMA gives us in order to pursue those objectives. And so in the immediate, I mean, I think there's a few things that at the federal level and at the provincial level we could be doing that our governments are not yet doing. I think, you know, an emphasis on not having workers pay the costs of the crisis is fundamental. We have an unemployment insurance system that has been absolutely gutted. Coverage for workers who lose their jobs went from about 80% in the 1980s or 90s to like 37% or something today. It's very low. So then that's a result of the eligibility changes, especially that happened at Chrétien in the mid-90s. So changing that and building back a functioning unemployment insurance system would be fundamental. Expanding it to cover other things like health, pharmacare, I think would also be another area where, as an immediate response to this crisis, I think governments could start acting right away. I campaigned, and the Council of Canadians and our chapters campaigned quite a bit on the question of pharmacare. And as happy as we were to see the legislation passed, it is the legislation and the program such as it is, covering only diabetes meds and contraceptives, is really just a start. And so in the context of a situation where, because of Trump's tariffs, workers are losing their jobs and consequently losing their health benefits, I think there's a really strong case for taking that program and putting money behind it and expanding it in order that people can have access to the medications they need when they get sick. I think there's been a lot of excellent work done on the response to Trump, and I think we have more leverage than our corporate elite would like us to believe, right? When it comes to our integration with the US for fossil fuels, I think an export tax on oil exports is an absolutely excellent idea, and we should have that on the table and ready to use it. I think we should be using the opportunity to use public procurement to help support our steel and aluminum industries as part of a kind of green transition, a kind of aggressive green industrial strategy. And I think, as a counter, and I would give full credit to the CCPA for really putting this idea out into the public sphere and pushing it as a counter to the kind of relentless drive for pipelines. I would say an east-west energy grid connecting provinces and connecting them for clean energy, I think is a perfect counter to this kind of push for greater fossil fuel infrastructure. I guess one other thing I'd like to point out too is a lot of the weakness and a lot of the vulnerability of Canada and Quebec, right, is due to the highly concentrated and really oligopolistic, monopolistic structure of a lot of our industries, right? And I think telecoms is one that really stood out for me in this crisis. Doug Ford, to his credit, at a certain point, was saying, well, we got to tear up the contract with Starlink, which is owned by Elon Musk. We got to hit Trump's people where it hurts. And yes, I think that's a good response to the crisis. But the question is, why were so many northern communities and rural communities in Ontario, and I believe in Quebec as well, dependent on Starlink, right? Because we have basically 3-4 companies that completely dominate the telecom sector. They build and they service customers in the large centers, and they completely neglect the rural areas. They don't build out the infrastructure to have high-speed internet in smaller centers. We don't actually have a public service there, right? And they're running these natural monopolies as you would expect any private corporation to do, which is they're absolutely sweating their assets for profit, and they're neglecting the people outside. And so I think public telecoms would be one area where we could at once reduce our dependence on these American companies that are tied to Donald Trump, and we could also do something really valuable in terms of giving people connectivity that don't have access to it now, and even using the profits from it to fund culture, which would be huge. So I'm going to wrap up. There were kind of two bigger questions that I did want to gesture to that I think we maybe don't talk about enough. One is monopoly power and market power in the Canadian economy in particular. For a long time, at least it's been my impression, we tend to think about neoliberalism as more competition, right? More markets, more competition, and that's it. And it has been that, especially for workers, right? But there is a kind of sub-strand, and I think working on questions of pharmacare and the pharmaceutical industry with the council especially has underlined this to me, is neoliberalism was also about bringing in strong intellectual property protections, and the monopolistic tendencies that created in our economy are absolutely huge. And they've had a really bad effect on Canada. Certainly our pharma industry is nowhere near where it should be. We saw that in the pandemic, where we just didn't have the capacity to do virtually anything. And we were dependent on the Americans, on Pfizer, et cetera, for vaccines. And we really had to basically beg them to sell us vaccines and paid quite a high price for that. So that's just one kind of aspect of it. But I think people have talked about, suspending IP payments to the Americans, right? Because we, in terms of balance of trade, we have a big deficit when it comes to intellectual property rents and revenues. And I think that's good. I mean, I agree, like as a negotiating thing, but I think people don't understand the degree to which that would be striking at the very root of the entire edifice, right? Like that's a quasi-revolutionary demand, and I support it. I think we should move away from it. I think the climate crisis is such that it's insane to see some people talking about patenting, new technologies that would allow us to fight climate change faster. We want the opposite, right? We want the fusion of these technologies as quickly as possible to as many countries as possible. And so we would want our innovations in that sector, especially, to be spread far and wide. And so I think that's a case for kind of open source innovation policies that would be really interesting. And so the last point, just that I feel like hasn't been explored enough, is we need to talk about China. At least in the spaces that I've seen in trade unions and in a lot of kind of even in progressive circles, there's just kind of like, we don't know enough about China. We don't have a sophisticated position on what Canada and Quebec's role in the world should be vis-a-vis China. The reflexive response of our corporate elites is to go along with the new Cold War, to ally with Trump, and really everything Trump is doing is all about China. And we need to question whether we want to be conscripted into this new Cold War, right? Whether that's really the best thing for Canada and for Quebec is to go along with this blindly. There was an interview with Steve Bannon shortly after Trump announced his tariffs and was talking about 51st state, and it was with Global News, and so the Canadian interviewer asked him, okay, well, isn't this just going to push Canada into the arms of China, right? And Bannon, for all his bluster and always having a tough guy response to every issue, had absolutely nothing to say to that question, right? And so I'm not saying we should become a vassal state to China any more than I'm happy with our current status as a vassal state to the US, but I'm saying we need to have a more serious discussion about our position in the world and our relations with China that isn't just reflexively anti-China. And so, yeah, just to conclude, I think the presentations and the workshops are going to get into this, and maybe we can get into this in the discussion. But we're living through a new Gilded Age, and I think we're facing deepening ecological, social, and geopolitical crises. Our democratic processes have been hollowed out, and people's rights have been usurped by increasingly unaccountable corporations and opaque international agreements. And it's clear to me that our corporate elite can't imagine a different world, right? And so I think even in this moment, if we don't have the political power to achieve the things we want now, it's fundamental for us to say that there's another way to go, to say that we're not confronted with the dead end of there is no alternative, and that there is another path we could take, and to mobilize people around a vision of a future that is rooted in peace and cooperation and solidarity. Thank you.